Dr. Townsell, I want to fast forward in history and get into the late 1700s, 1800s. You talked about Sunni Islam. So let's get into it. Who are the Mahdis? And when you listen to English speakers, I think they call it Mahdis or something like that.
hmm Yes. So in Sudan, there is perhaps no name that is more associated with political power than the Mahdis,
Oh,
right?
wow.
They are the Kennedys, they are the Clintons, they are the Bushes, they are the Washingtons, they are
Wow.
the family, right? And this all traces back to kind of the person who is known as the father of Sudanese nationalism, the Mahdi himself, Muhammad Ahmed. So in the 1800s, what is today the Sudan was a virtual Egyptian colony, right? In 1821, Muhammad Ali, who is the second most famous Muhammad Ali in history, but Muhammad Ali, who was the Ottoman viceroy of Egypt, basically conquers the Sudan in pursuit of a slave army, right? And so Sudan is ruled by this Ottoman Egyptian administration from 1821 until 1885. And the reason why it ends in 1885 is because this Sufi cleric in the Sudan, known as Muhammad Ahmed, publicly proclaims himself to be the Islamic long awaited messianic figure, the Mahdi, right? Who will basically rise up and bring, you know, order out of chaos and will kind of restore, a true vision of Islamic society, right? He declared that the Ottoman Egyptian administration in Egypt was corrupt and that he would basically free these Sudanese from this colonial bondage.
If I may interrupt you for one moment, please.
Sure.
I'm familiar with the term Mahdi or Mahdi, as they pronounce it in English, but that's the 12th Imam of the Shiite sect of Islam. But Sudan is very much a Sunni country.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
So
explain that, please.
exactly. No, so you are exactly right, right? In that the Mahdi, or that this term Mahdi, which means divinely guided one,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that is kind of very closely connected with Shia Islam as opposed to Sunni Islam, right? And in
Yeah.
Shia Islam, right, it has come to denote a kind of messianic person, right, whose presence will bring in, this era of justice, right,
Yeah.
before the end of time, right? So it's very much a kind of millenarian aspect as well, right?
Yeah.
But we know, right, that there have been a plethora of people throughout Islamic history who have claimed this title,
I
right?
see. So it's not exclusive late in the later centuries to Shiaism.
Exactly.
I
And by the
see.
end of the 19th century, right? So by the end of the 1800s, when French and British colonialism is really kind of rapidly expanding in predominantly Islamic lands, right? Whether we're talking about Sudan, Syria, Egypt, right? We know that there were modest revolts that were very common, right? And so
Oh, I didn't
the
know that.
revolt that took
Interesting.
place in Sudan was only one of several, right?
I see. I see.
Um, and so one could say then that despite the fact that kind of from a purely religious standpoint, the term Mahdi is, as you say, connected with Shia Islam, that the kind of meaning of the term has expanded,
Yeah,
right?
that makes sense.
So yeah.
Going back to 1885, later 19th century,
hmm
um, I want to use a phrase that you used to explain this era. You said virtual Egyptian colony, which kind of makes it a bit of a interesting situation. Egypt becomes a colony of Britain, which makes Sudan, if I'm explaining this correctly, a colony of a colony.
Exactly. Right. And
How does
so
that work?
Yeah, so it's really weird. So in 1885, the Mahdists successfully expel this Turco-Egyptian administration, but then it is reconquered by the Union Jack in 1898. And the reason why the British were so interested, not only is because some of the world's best cotton is grown in the Sudan, and so there was absolutely a
Oh,
kind of economic
yeah, yeah,
impulse,
yeah.
but also, right, during the scramble for Africa, there was very much a kind of there was very much a concern within kind of British imperial Christendom that Islam was Christendom's primary foe, right? And Sudan, I have often said,
Ah,
and this might be controversial, but I think it works at least as a kind of pop culture reference. The Sudanese Mahdi was in some ways the late Victorian version of Osama bin Laden. And that's not
ah,
me saying that the Mahdi was a, murderous terrorist or anything like that. What I am saying is that the Sudanese Mahdi became the face for the Victorian imagination of violent, dark Islam, the kind of counter to the civilizing light, right? And the gospel and, purity and empire. And so there is a massive British invasion and, revenge taken for the death of Charles Gordon, right? This famous British soldier hero who was beheaded by, the Mahdists in 1885. And so a young war correspondent by the name of Winston Churchill
come
actually
on.
participates, yes,
Oh
in
boy.
the reconquering of the Sudan. And so basically, Sudan for about 55 years, so from 1898 until 1956, is known as the Anglo-Egyptian condominium, right? It's this
I
really
mean, say
unique,
that again. Condominium, like a building?
absolutely. And so what that basically meant is that, to your point, Sudan was, at least nominally speaking, still a protectorate of Egypt, but Egypt was a protectorate of Great Britain, right? And so what happens is that Sudan is a condominium. To this day, if you, want to basically research the history of early 20th century Sudan, you don't go to the colonial office. You have to go to the foreign office in London. So this kind of like singular designation within the British
Interesting.
Empire, where, as it has been said, Egypt paid, England ruled.
So,
Right.
for all intents and purposes, Sudan was actually a colony, but
Oh yes,
categorization was a colony of a colony. Hence, its records were within the Foreign Office, not in the colonial. That's just
exactly. Yeah.
semantics. And Winston Churchill is involved in this. I mean, as a young
Yes. A
man then.
young Winston. Yes.
Um, at the top of our segment, when I asked you about Mahdis, you said, they're like the Clintons and the Kennedys and the Washingtons and all of that. You named several uh, political families, uh, known figures in our history. Does that mean the Mahdis had several generations of rulers, or at least impactful uh, people in Sudan's history?
Yes. So the one of the Mahdi's sons, and he had many sons, but one of the Mahdi's sons becomes, in the mid 20th century, the leader of one of the primary Sudanese nationalist parties, known as the Umma Party, UMMA. Um,
Ummah being the people. Yeah, okay.
exactly. And then one of the Mahdi's, I believe either grandsons or great grandsons, Sadiq al Mahdi, becomes a very prominent Sudanese prime minister in the 1980s.
Oh,
right?
wow. Okay.
Yeah, so for a roughly 100-year period, right? The Al Mahdis were very much kind of the name was golden, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if it's that way today. Certainly, because of the, recently concluded Bashir
Yeah.
dictatorship, things are a bit different now. But that's just to say that the Mahdi name, right?
Yeah.
It was very noble. And what's even, as an interesting story, um, when George the Sixth, right, who was the father of the recently deceased Queen Elizabeth, um, when George the Sixth is coronated, one of the Mahdi's sons actually sends a sword as a coronation gift and as a sign of, you know, we used to have really bad relations, but now we have goodwill. And so, we are presenting this sword as a, God bless you, King Regnant George the Sixth. So I don't know where that sword is held, but I'm sure it is somewhere, maybe in Windsor Castle or,
One of the palaces. Yeah. Yeah.
right. Yeah, exactly.
My family and I were just in England and we saw the family jewels. We didn't come
Oh,
across that
nice. Okay.
sword. Yeah, but maybe in one of the many palaces.
Right, right.
We'll be back after a short break to talk about South Sudan. We'll be right back.